She didn't marry for love. She married for a roof that didn't leak and a life where she didn't have to count every penny in her head before falling asleep. It was a cold, honest trade, and in that honesty, there was no shame. Just the heavy, quiet reality of a woman who had run out of choices. Sometimes life shrinks down to the basics. A place to sleep, a plate of food, and the guarantee of a tomorrow that looks exactly like today. If you're watching this, let me know in the comments. Where are you watching from today? Are you from a big city or a small town like the one in this story? Olya arrived at the remote village, stepped into a house that wasn't hers, and decided the best way to survive was to expect nothing. Not from the place, not from the people, and certainly not from herself. A month passed in a blur of grey skies and wooden fences, and then something began to change, not with a bang or a dramatic twist, but slowly, through the tiny details you only notice if you're watching closely. Olya was watching, and one night, she saw something that changed the entire foundation of the deal she had made. Even though on the surface, absolutely nothing looked different. The bus ride there had felt like an omen, smelling of diesel and other people's damp lives, as she held her single bag on her knees and realized her entire world now fit into a piece of luggage. 3 hours to the village of Maly Vyselki on the only bus of the day, with a driver who looked at the passengers as if to make sure they understood there was no turning back once those wheels started moving. Olya's new life was defined by the silence of Aunt Zena's spare room and the rhythmic counting of telephone poles through the bus window. But the real weight of her decision didn't hit her until she met Stepan and his son. Stepan was a man carved out of old oak and sun-beaten leather, a farmer who looked at Olya not as a person, but as a practical solution to a structural problem in his household. He didn't offer a warm welcome. He offered a list of chores and a room at the end of the hall, speaking in short, clipped sentences that sounded like the striking of a hammer against a cold nail. Then there was Roman, the son who sat by the window in a wheelchair, his back always turned to the world as if he were trying to merge with the glass. At 26, his life had become a static photograph, frozen by an accident that everyone talked about in whispers but no one fully explained. The air in the house was thick with the scent of old wood, dried onions, and a heavy, unexpressed grief that Stepan tried to drown out with talk of the farm and the cows. Olya moved through the rooms like a ghost, cleaning, cooking, and learning the map of a house that felt more like a fortress of secrets than a home. She watched how Stepan looked at his son, a mixture of desperate love and a crushing kind of guilt that made him over-explain everything, as if words could fill the space where Roman's footsteps used to be. Roman himself was a wall of cold indifference, his voice a flat, monotone hello that contained exactly 2 syllables and 0 emotion. He didn't look at Olya when she brought him tea. He looked through her, treating her presence as a temporary inconvenience, like a draft under a door that would eventually be fixed. But Olya wasn't just a draft. She was a witness, and she began to notice things that didn't fit the narrative of a man who had completely given up. She saw the way his books were moved by just an inch when he thought no one was looking, and she heard the faint, rhythmic sounds coming from his room in the dead of night when the rest of the village was submerged in sleep. It wasn't the sound of a man resting. It was the sound of effort, of struggle, of someone fighting a war in total darkness. Every morning, she would find him back in his chair, his hands resting limply on his knees, playing the part of the broken son perfectly for an audience of one, his father. Stepan would sigh, grab his coat, and head out to the fields, never suspecting that the silence he left behind was actually a mask. Olya began to realize that this house wasn't just a refuge for her. It was a stage where everyone was playing a role to protect someone else from a truth too sharp to handle. She felt a strange rising tension in her chest every time she entered Roman's room, a feeling that she was stepping into a trap or a sanctuary, and she couldn't yet tell which one it was. The village outside was a blur of grey fences and judgmental eyes, with neighbors like Nura appearing at the door under the guise of borrowing salt, just to see how the new girl was holding up in the house of the broken boy. Olya realized that her roof over her head came with a price much higher than she had anticipated, and it wasn't just the work or the isolation. It was the burden of knowing that something was very, very wrong. The transition from being a stranger to being a wife was a surreal blur of paperwork and heavy silences of the lie, a ceremony that felt more like a business merger than a union of souls. In the regional registry office, the woman behind the desk rattled off words about love and eternal commitment with the same enthusiasm she might use to read the instructions on a microwave, her voice bouncing off the cold, institutional walls while Olya stared at Roman's hands. They were gripped tight on the armrests of his wheelchair, his knuckles turning a ghostly white, a physical manifestation of a tension that he refused to let reach his face. Stepan stood behind them like a silent guardian, his camera phone held high as he tried to capture a moment of joy that didn't exist, his face a mask of desperate hope that this new arrangement would somehow fix the shattered pieces of his lineage. When they returned to the house, now officially bound by law and the expectations of a prying village, the air seemed to grow even thinner, more pressurized, as if the walls themselves were closing in to see how they would handle the intimacy of their forced proximity. That evening, Stepan brought out a bottle of homemade wine, the dark glass sweating in the heat of the kitchen as he poured 3 glasses and offered a toast to the young couple and the future of the farm. The wine was tart and sharp, biting at the back of Olya's throat, and as she watched Roman sip his drink with his eyes fixed on the tabletop, she felt a wave of profound isolation wash over her. She realized then that she wasn't just there to clean floors. She was there to be a living, breathing piece of furniture that made the house feel less like a tomb, a silent partner in a tragedy she was only beginning to understand. Every creak of the floorboards and every sigh of the wind through the eaves began to sound like a question she didn't have the answer to, and she found herself staying up late into the night, just listening to the heartbeat of the old wooden structure. It was during these hours of total darkness, when even the dogs in the village had stopped barking, that the sound returned, that rhythmic, straining noise from behind the wall of Roman's room. It wasn't the sound of a man who had accepted his fate. It was the sound of someone trying to break through a barrier with nothing but their bare hands. Olya would lie in her bed, her breath held so tight it hurt, visualizing what was happening on the other side of the wood, the image of Roman's supposedly useless legs fighting against the gravity of his situation. The village of Maly Vyselki was a place where secrets were currency, and Olya felt like she was suddenly the richest person in town, carrying the weight of a truth that could either save this family or burn it to the ground. She thought about Aunt Zina and the deal that had been brokered, realizing that everyone had been so focused on what Olya was getting, a roof, food, security, that they had completely ignored what she was giving up, the right to a life that wasn't a lie. She started to look at the objects in the house differently, noticing how a book on Roman's nightstand was always in a slightly different position every time she entered, or how the dust on the floor was disturbed in patterns that didn't match the tracks of a wheelchair. It was a game of cat and mouse played in the margins of the day, a silent communication between two people who were both trapped in different kinds of prisons. Olya felt a strange, cold fire beginning to burn in her chest, a mixture of anger at the deception and a terrifying curiosity about the man she had married. She began to wonder if Stepan knew, if he was part of the theater, or if he was the most tragic character of all, a father being lied to by the one person he lived for. The weight of the secret was a physical presence, a stone in her stomach that made it hard to eat the food Stepan provided, and she realized that the peace she had traded her freedom for was actually a war zone disguised as a quiet country home. The suspicion finally boiled over into a moment of pure, heart-stopping clarity that changed everything Olya thought she knew about the man she had married. It happened on a Tuesday, one of those heavy, overcast afternoons where the sky seems to hang just inches above the rooftops, grey and suffocating. Stepan had headed into the district center to settle some accounts at the dairy, leaving the house in a silence so thick you could almost hear the dust settling on the furniture. Olya had been working in the garden, her hands deep in the cold, damp earth, but she'd forgotten a knife on the kitchen windowsill and had to double back. She entered through the rear door, her steps muffled by her thick woolen socks, moving through the hallway with the quiet grace of someone who had learned to navigate this house without making a sound. She reached the door to Roman's room, which was cracked open just a sliver, and that's when she heard it. Not the sound of a page turning or the soft whir of wheels, but the sound of heavy, rhythmic breathing and the unmistakable creak of floorboards under a massive weight. She froze, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird, and she leaned in, her eye finding the gap in the wood. Inside the room, bathed in a shaft of pale, sickly light, Roman wasn't in his chair. He was standing. He was gripped onto the heavy wooden windowsill with both hands, his knuckles white as bone, his entire body trembling with the sheer, agonizing effort of verticality. His legs, those supposedly dead, useless limbs, were shaking violently, but they were supporting him, pushing against the floor with a desperate, primitive strength. Olya watched, paralyzed by the sight, As he slowly, painfully shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated pain and fury. This wasn't a man who couldn't walk. This was a man who was teaching himself to live again in total secrecy, hiding his progress from the father who worshipped him and the wife who was supposed to care for him. The air in the room felt electric, charged with the energy of his secret struggle, and Olya felt a wave of nausea hit her as the pieces of the puzzle finally slammed into place. Every night of rhythmic thumping, every shifted book, every calculated monotone conversation. It was all part of a massive, elaborate performance designed to keep him in that chair. But why? Why would a man choose to stay a prisoner in his own body when the key was right there in his hands? As she watched, he let out a low, guttural groan, his strength finally failing him, and he collapsed back into the wheelchair with a sound that felt like a gunshot in the quiet house. He sat there for a moment, head bowed, chest heaving, sweat dripping from his chin onto his shirt, and then, with a chilling efficiency, he smoothed his hair, wiped his face, and arranged his legs back into their limp position. He went from a warrior to a victim in 5 seconds flat, a transformation so complete it made Olya's skin crawl. She realized then that the accident on the roof wasn't just a tragedy. It was a choice, a way to anchor himself to this life, or perhaps a way to punish the people around him. Just as she was about to pull away, the front gate groaned on its hinges. Stepan was back early. Olya saw Roman's head snap toward the window, his eyes wide with a flash of genuine, cold terror. He wasn't afraid of being crippled. He was terrified of being caught getting better. Olya stepped back into the shadows, her mind reeling, realizing that her simple life was now a tightrope walk over a bottomless pit of deception, and the man she thought was a helpless burden was actually the most dangerous person in the house. The air in the house became a living thing, thick and heavy with the weight of what Olya had seen, a secret that sat between her and Roman like a sharpening blade. For the next week, every interaction felt like a high-stakes poker game where the cards were made of glass. She would set his breakfast down, watching those hands, those strong, capable hands that had gripped the windowsill, and she would wonder how he could keep the lie so perfectly still. She found herself moving through her chores with a new, frantic energy, scrubbing floors and hauling water until her muscles ached, just to keep her mind from spiraling into the why of it all. Why did he want his father to see him as a ghost? Why did he let Stepan carry the crushing guilt of that night on the roof like a sack of stones, when he was clearly clawing his way back to the world of the living? The tension peaked when Roman's old friend Grisha showed up in a dust-covered car from the city, bringing with him the smell of expensive cigarettes and the sharp, urgent energy of a world that hadn't stopped spinning. Grisha sat in the kitchen, his eyes darting around the modest room with a mixture of pity and frustration, and he told Olya stories of the Roman he used to know, the one who was supposed to leave, the one who had a job and a life waiting for him beyond the grey fences of this village. "He was supposed to come with me," Grisha whispered, his voice cracking as he stared into a glass of water. The job was set, the apartment was ready, and then, that night on the roof. Olya listened, her heart cold, as the image of that night began to shift into something darker. She saw a young man trapped between a father who couldn't let go and a future that terrified him, a man who perhaps found a way to stay by falling. When Grisha went into Roman's room, the voices that drifted through the door weren't filled with the warmth of old friendship, but the jagged edges of a confrontation. "You're not even trying, Rom," Grisha shouted, his voice muffled but sharp with agony. "The doctors said if you did the work, if you pushed. It's been 2 years." And then, the response from Roman, that same flat, dead monotone that Olya now knew was a weapon. "There is nothing to push against, Grisha. Go back to the city." The cruelty of it was breathtaking, a calculated push to drive away the last person who expected anything from him. When Grisha finally left, looking defeated and aged, he stopped Olya at the gate, his eyes red-rimmed and hollow. "You're not a wife to him," he said, his voice a low, warning growl. "You're a jailer. Or a nurse. Just make sure he doesn't break what's left of himself." He drove away, leaving a cloud of dust that tasted like copper and regret, and Olya stood there for a long time, watching the road until her eyes stung. She went back inside, her mind made up, and instead of going to the kitchen, she walked straight into Roman's room without knocking. He was back in his chair, the book, The Quiet Dawn, open on his lap, looking for all the world like a man who hadn't moved an inch in hours. Olya didn't say a word. She walked over to the nightstand, picked up the book, and moved it to the very edge of the table, lining it up perfectly with the corner. Then she turned and looked him dead in the eye. "I know," she said, her voice steady and devoid of the fear that usually colored her world. "I know about the window. I know about the nights. And I know you're not as broken as you want everyone to think." For a moment, the mask held, that blank, distant stare that made him look like a statue. But then, a flicker of something raw and terrifyingly alive sparked in his pupils. His jaw tightened, the muscles in his neck roping with a sudden, violent tension, and for the first time, he really looked at her, not as a piece of furniture, but as a threat. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was a battlefield, and Olya realized that by speaking the truth, she had just set fire to the only safety he had left, forcing him to choose between the comfort of his lie and the terrifying possibility of a life he had tried so hard to kill. The air in the room didn't just turn cold, it turned heavy, like the atmosphere before a massive storm, as Roman's mask finally cracked and fell away, leaving behind a man who looked twice as dangerous as the invalid he had been pretending to be. He didn't deny it, he didn't shout, and he didn't try to play the victim. Instead, he gripped the armrests of his chair so hard the old wood groaned, and he stared at Olya with a gaze that was sharp enough to draw blood. "And what are you going to do with that knowledge, Olya?" he asked, his voice no longer a monotone drone but a low, jagged rasp that vibrated with a lifetime of repressed anger. "Are you going to run to my father? Are you going to tell him his son is a liar so he can start hoping again, just so he can be disappointed when I inevitably fail him?" The raw, bleeding honesty of his words hit Olya harder than any lie could have, and she realized that his deception wasn't born out of malice, but out of a desperate, twisted kind of love. A fear that if he tried to be whole and failed, the disappointment would kill Stepan faster than the truth ever could. She stood her ground, her shadow long against the floorboards, and she told him that she wasn't his father, she wasn't Grisha, and she certainly wasn't going to be his accomplice in a suicide of the soul. "I'm not telling him anything," she whispered, leaning closer until she could smell the sweat and the old paper and the iron in his breath. "Because I don't care about his hope. I care about the fact that I didn't move to this god-forsaken village to watch a man bury himself alive while I hold the shovel." The standoff lasted for what felt like an eternity, the silence of the house pressing in around them, until suddenly, the back door slammed shut and Stepan's heavy boots thudded in the hallway, returning from the fields. Roman's eyes widened, the instinctive terror of being caught returning to his face. But Olya didn't move, she didn't flinch, and she didn't look away. Stepan appeared in the doorway, his face weary and streaked with the dirt of the farm, looking from his wife to his son with a confused, tentative smile. "Everything all right in here?" he asked, his voice trembling with that constant, fragile optimism that had kept him going for 2 years. Olya felt Roman's gaze burning into her, a silent, desperate plea for her to keep the secret, to let the lie live for just one more day. But she knew that if she stayed silent now, they would all drown in this house together. She looked at Stepan, then back at Roman, and she saw the warrior she had glimpsed at the window, the man who had been fighting in the dark, and she realized he just needed someone to take the first step for him. "Stepan," she said, her voice ringing out clear and steady, cutting through the thick layer of grief that had muffled this house for too long. "Roman was just telling me that he's ready to see that new doctor in the district center. The one Grisha mentioned." The silence that followed was deafening, a vacuum that sucked the air out of the room as Stepan's face transformed from confusion to a shock so profound he had to lean against the doorframe for support. Roman sat frozen, his breath hitching in his chest, his hands trembling on his knees, but as he looked at his father's tears, the first real, honest tears of hope he had seen in years, the tension in his shoulders finally broke. He didn't scream at her. He didn't fall apart. He just let out a long, shaky exhale that sounded like a prisoner finally stepping out into the light. "Yes, Dad," Roman whispered, his voice cracking but certain. "I'm ready." In that moment, the deal Olya had made for a roof and a bed turned into something she never expected, a purpose. She realized she hadn't just found a place to hide from her own failures. She had found a place where she could be the catalyst for someone else's survival. As the weeks passed and the grey autumn turned into a crisp, biting winter, the rhythmic sounds from Roman's room didn't stop. They got louder, bolder, and more frequent, but now they weren't a secret kept in the dark. They were a promise. One morning, as the first real snow began to blanket the fields of Maly Vyselki, Olya stood by the kitchen window and watched as Roman, supported by his father on one side and a pair of crutches on the other, took his first, agonizingly slow steps onto the porch. He looked up at the sky, the cold wind whipping his hair, and for the first time since she had arrived, he looked at her and smiled, a real, genuine smile that told her the war was over. She didn't have to count the telephone poles anymore, and she didn't have to count her pennies in the dark. She was finally home, not because of a contract, but because she had chosen to stay and fight for a life that was finally, beautifully, undeniably real. The cycle of the village continued, with neighbors whispering and the seasons changing. But inside that old wooden house, the silence was finally gone, replaced by the sound of footsteps and the messy, complicated, wonderful noise of a family that had been reborn. Olya picked up her knitting, sat down by the stove, and listened to the house breathe. No longer a tomb, but a home that was finally truly alive.